Livye had been killed by a drug cartel because Matthew owed them money.
On the morning of Halloween 2020, a shocking discovery rocked the peaceful town of Hemp Hill. Livye Lewis, a promising young woman with a bright future ahead of her, was found dead in her car, shot in the neck, her life stolen in a moment. But what really happened that night? Who could have done this to someone so full of promise, someone loved by everyone who knew her? Was it a crime of passion or something far more sinister? In this exclusive, in-depth analysis, only here on our channel. Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where shadows hide the truth. On the morning of Halloween 2020, a small town in Texas was forever changed by a discovery that would leave more questions than answers. Livye Lewis, just 19 years old, was found lifeless in her car. The circumstances surrounding her death would lead investigators down a twisted path, uncovering a dark side to the people she loved and trusted. Livye, a bright and caring young woman, had been a nursing assistant dedicated to caring for others. But on that fateful morning, it was clear that someone had taken that care from her. Her life was violently cut short, and the killer left a trail of blood, lies, and unanswered questions. As the investigation began, the first clues pointed to Matthew Edgar, Livye's boyfriend. He was found near the scene, covered in blood, but with no memory of what happened. Was he the victim of a blackout, or was he the one who pulled the trigger? Matthew's story was confusing from the start. He claimed to have blacked out after a night of drinking. When authorities asked him how he ended up behind the vehicle where Livye's body was found, his answer was simple: "I don't know." But as detectives dug deeper, they found more inconsistencies in his story, and the pieces began to fit together in a way they didn't expect. Matthew claimed he had no memory of what happened that night. But the evidence didn't lie. DNA results and forensic evidence told a different story. It seemed Matthew was involved in the death of Livye, but why? And what had really happened between them that led to this tragic event? Livye was loved by everyone who knew her. Her compassion, her dedication to nursing, it was her calling. She had everything going for her, a future full of promise. But behind closed doors, her relationship with Matthew Edgar was anything but perfect. Was it possible that the man who was supposed to love her was the one who took her life? As the case unfolded, Livye's friends and family spoke out, revealing troubling details about her relationship with Matthew. Text messages uncovered a pattern of manipulation, jealousy, and control. But could it have gone as far as murder? As the days passed, the investigation into Livye Lewis's death only deepened the mystery. Matthew Edgar, once the prime suspect, continued to insist he had no memory of the events surrounding her death. But as the detectives dug deeper into his past, they discovered a troubling pattern of behavior, an obsession with control, and a history of violence. Montana, Matthew's ex-wife, had always known him as a man of extremes. Charming one moment, volatile the next. According to Montana, Matthew's jealousy was a constant source of tension in their relationship. But Livye, young and full of hope, was drawn to him despite the red flags. Livye had a heart full of dreams, but her relationship with Matthew was anything but what it seemed. Text messages between the two revealed a troubling dynamic: Matthew's possessiveness, his manipulation, and the emotional toll it took on Livye. Was this a case of love gone wrong, or something far darker? When authorities arrived at the scene, they found Livye's body slumped over the steering wheel of her car. The rifle, which had been used to end her life, lay nearby. But what was more perplexing was Matthew's behavior. Unharmed, yet covered in Livye's blood. And his story, one that seemed to change with every retelling, only raised more questions. As Matthew sat before detectives, his answers became more erratic. He claimed that he remembered nothing. But how could someone who claimed to be so in love with Livye not know how she ended up dead in her car? His lack of emotion, The way he seemed more concerned about his own fate than Livye's raised suspicion. It wasn't long before investigators started connecting the dots. Among the texts that Matthew had sent Livye were messages that revealed a darker side to their relationship. Words of love quickly turned into words of control, jealousy, and anger. One text even contained a confession from Matthew about cheating on Livye with his ex-wife. But was this all just a sign of a troubled relationship, or was it a prelude to a much more sinister act? With every passing day, the investigators grew more confident. The evidence was stacking up against Matthew Edgar, but there was one thing that still lingered. Did he really not remember? Or was he simply hiding the truth? After months of investigation, it was time for Matthew Edgar to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom, which had once been a place of quiet anticipation, now buzzed with energy. Energy that stemmed from the deep emotions of those who had known and loved Livye. The defense's strategy was clear from the start: cast doubt. Matthew's attorney argued that the case against him wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. They suggested that the DNA evidence found on the rifle and at the crime scene could have been planted or misinterpreted. They also leaned heavily on Matthew's claim of memory loss, suggesting that he may have been unaware of his own actions. But the prosecution was equally determined to prove Matthew's guilt. They presented a mountain of evidence: text messages, DNA analysis, and witness testimonies that painted a damning picture of the man accused of taking Livye's life. The prosecution's case was simple. Matthew Edgar had killed Livye Lewis, and it was time to hold him accountable for his actions. For Darcy Bass, the trial was not just about seeking justice for her daughter, it was about finding closure. She had lost her child, and now she had to sit through the heart-wrenching process of watching the man accused of her murder attempt to weasel his way out of responsibility. The defense's next move was to challenge the testimony of Livye's friends and co-workers. They tried to paint Matthew's relationship with Livye as complicated but not abusive, arguing that their connection was built on love and that any conflict between them was merely the result of immaturity. But as more evidence came to light, it became clear that there was more at play than just a troubled relationship. Livye's best friend, Taylor Barnett, took the stand and shared what Livye had told her about the relationship with Matthew. Taylor described the emotional and physical abuse Livye had endured, recounting the times Livye confided in her about Matthew's jealousy and controlling behavior. It was clear that the defense's narrative was beginning to crumble. Then came the forensic evidence. The prosecution presented the DNA samples that had been gathered from the crime scene, samples that linked Matthew to the rifle used in Livye's murder. The most damning evidence, however, was a sample of blood found on Matthew's clothing, which matched Livye's DNA. It seemed the evidence was undeniable, and the jury was left with little doubt about his involvement in the crime. Matthew sat in silence as the prosecution's case unfolded. His claims of memory loss and his inability to explain his actions were slowly losing credibility as the evidence mounted against him. What once seemed like a defense strategy had now turned into a series of holes that couldn't be filled. As Matthew Edgar's trial continued, it was clear that this wasn't a local story. It had become national news. The murder of Livye Lewis had captivated the public, drawing attention from media outlets across the country. People wanted to know who was responsible for the death of the bright young woman whose life had been so brutally cut short. With each passing day, the media frenzy grew. Livye's story was now a symbol of a deeper issue: abuse, control, and the dangers that lurk behind closed doors. Social media was buzzing with theories, opinions, and outrage as people from all over the world followed the trial closely. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForLivye quickly gained momentum. supporters of Livye's family flooded the internet with messages of solidarity. Many shared their own experiences of abuse, using Livye's story as a way to bring attention to the issue of toxic relationships and the hidden dangers of manipulation and control. In Hemp Hill, the small town where Livye had grown up, the impact of her death was felt deeply. Residents who had once known her as a bright, caring young woman now found themselves grappling with the dark secrets that had been hidden beneath the surface of her relationship with Matthew Edgar. Livye's mother, Darcy Bass, spoke to reporters, sharing her heartache, but also her determination to see justice done. "I never imagined my daughter would end up like this," Darcy said, her voice choked with emotion. "But I won't rest until the truth comes out." The public outcry only intensified as the trial progressed. Across the country, people were demanding that Matthew Edgar be held accountable for his actions. The case had become a rallying cry for those who had suffered in silence, giving them a platform to share their own stories and push for change. For the community, this case had become more than just a trial. It was a reflection of the darker side of relationships that often goes unnoticed. As the media continued to cover every development in the trial, the public's demand for justice grew louder. For Darcy, this was not just about seeking justice for her daughter, it was about ensuring that Livye's legacy would live on. She wanted the world to know who Livye was, what she stood for, and how her life had been tragically taken away by someone who was supposed to love her. As the trial of Matthew Edgar neared its conclusion, the weight of the evidence against him was undeniable. The prosecution had laid out a case that painted a clear picture of guilt, and now it was up to the jury to decide whether justice for Livye Lewis would be served. The prosecutor's closing argument was emotional and direct. They emphasized the overwhelming evidence: Livye's blood on Matthew's clothes, the DNA found on the rifle, the text messages that showed a pattern of manipulation and abuse. They described how Livye had trusted Matthew, only for that trust to be betrayed in the most violent way imaginable. On the other side, Matthew's defense attorney tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They continued to push the narrative that Matthew's memory loss was genuine, that the events leading to Livye's death had been a tragic accident, or perhaps even a crime of passion in the heat of an argument. But none of it seemed to resonate with the jury. The evidence was clear, and the emotional testimonies from Livye's friends and family left no room for doubt. Taylor Barnett, one of Livye's closest friends, took the stand once more, her voice shaky but resolute. She spoke of the bruises she had seen on Livye's body, the emotional toll of the relationship with Matthew, and the fear that Livye had expressed about him. Taylor's words rang out in the courtroom, a powerful reminder of the warning signs that had been ignored until it was too late. Throughout it all, Matthew sat motionless in the defendant's chair. His lack of emotion was striking, especially when compared to the pain and grief of Livye's family. It was as if he was detached from the reality of the consequences he faced. Was he truly remorseful? Or had he simply played a part in a story that he knew would come to an end with him as the villain? The jury deliberated for hours, carefully weighing the evidence and the testimonies they had heard over the past few weeks. It was clear that this was not an easy decision, but as the day wore on, the jurors returned to the courtroom, their faces serious and their eyes fixed on the judge. Matthew Edgar's fate now lay in the hands of those who had listened to the painful details of his relationship with Livye, the tragic night of her death, and the evidence that connected him to the crime. The moment of truth had finally arrived. The moment everyone had been waiting for had arrived. The jury had deliberated long and hard, and now they were ready to deliver their verdict. For Livye Lewis's family and friends, the wait felt like an eternity. Had justice been served, or would the man accused of taking Livye's life walk free? As the judge read the verdict, the courtroom fell into complete silence. Matthew Edgar was found guilty of the murder of Livye Lewis. There was no more doubt. The evidence had spoken loud and clear, and the jury had decided that Matthew Edgar was responsible for Livye's tragic death. For Livye's mother, Darcy, the moment was bittersweet. While she had finally gotten the justice she had fought so hard for, it didn't bring her daughter back. No verdict, no sentence could undo the pain of losing her child. But at least for now, the man who took her life would face the consequences of his actions. The defense, though disappointed, immediately began preparing for the next phase of the trial, the sentencing. Matthew Edgar had been found guilty, but the question remained: how long would he spend behind bars? Would he be held accountable for the full extent of his crime? At a press conference, the prosecutor spoke to the media, expressing gratitude for the hard work of the investigators and the jury. This case was a painful one, the prosecutor said, but it was necessary. Livye's story needed to be told, and the person responsible for her death needed to be held accountable. For Livye's loved ones, there was a sense of closure, but it was tempered with grief. They had fought for justice, and now they could begin to heal. But the loss of Livye, a young woman with so much promise, would never truly leave them. Her memory would live on, a reminder of the young woman who had been stolen too soon. "I will carry Livye in my heart forever," Darcy said, her eyes filled with tears. "She was my world, and now the world will know who she was. I won't let her be forgotten." As the town of Hemp Hill slowly returned to its quiet existence, the memory of Livye Lewis would remain a powerful force. The tragedy of her death had opened the eyes of many to the dangers of abusive relationships, the power of control, and the importance of standing up for what's right. But for Darcy, her fight was far from over. She would continue to advocate for her daughter's legacy, ensuring that Livye's life would not be defined by how it ended, but by how she lived. The trial of Matthew Edgar was over, but for Livye Lewis's family, the journey was far from complete. The loss of their beloved daughter, sister, and friend was something they would never fully recover from. But through their grief, they found strength to carry on Livye's memory, strength to ensure that her story would never be forgotten. Livye's story had touched many lives. From the nursing home where she worked to the friends she had made along the way, Livye was remembered as a kind, selfless, and dedicated young woman. Her dreams of becoming a nurse had been cut short, but her legacy as a caring, compassionate soul would live on. For Darcy, Livye's death was a wound that would never fully heal. Yet she found solace in knowing that Livye's legacy would continue. "I raised her to be strong, and I will keep fighting for her," Darcy said. "I want the world to know that Livye was more than just a victim. She was a fighter." After Livye Lewis's tragic death, investigators knew they were up against a complicated and puzzling case. With Matthew Edgar's inconsistent story, it was clear that something was amiss. But where did the truth lie? Was he guilty of murder, or was he the victim of circumstances beyond his control? Matthew had claimed blackout memories. He said he had no recollection of the events that led to Livye's death. Yet his actions spoke volumes. When authorities arrived on the scene, he was found with blood on his face and clothes. The scene was chilling. The blood stains, the rifle, the fact that Matthew had no injuries to explain his condition, raised serious doubts. The timeline was key to understanding what had happened that night. Matthew had been seen drinking with Livye earlier that evening, before their night took a dangerous turn. At some point, Livye was shot in the neck with a rifle, and Matthew, disoriented and covered in blood, was found lying near the crime scene. What had led to this deadly confrontation? Was it a crime of passion, or was something far more sinister at play? As the investigation continued, text messages between Livye and Matthew revealed a troubling side to their relationship. Livye had confided in her friends about Matthew's jealousy, possessiveness, and the emotional abuse she had suffered. One text even revealed physical abuse. Livye admitted that she was afraid of Matthew at times. But what drove him to violence on that fateful night? The rifle, a key piece of evidence, was found near Livye's car. But it wasn't just any rifle. The forensic team found that Livye's DNA was on the weapon, along with Matthew's fingerprints. This wasn't a random crime, it was personal. And as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern of manipulation and control, one that Matthew had used on Livye throughout their relationship. A close friend of Livye, who had witnessed the volatile nature of her relationship with Matthew, testified that Livye had told her she feared for her safety. Livye had confided that she was often manipulated, and she was becoming increasingly isolated from her support network. Matthew's obsession with controlling her was growing, and Livye's freedom was slipping away. The forensic investigation confirmed what investigators had already suspected. Matthew was not only at the scene, but he was deeply involved in the crime. Blood found on Matthew's clothing matched Livye's DNA, and the rifle used to kill her had his prints. Still, Matthew clung to his story. He had no memory of what happened. Could this be true, or was it a convenient excuse? The trial of Matthew Edgar was nothing short of a battle for the truth. On one side, the prosecution had a mountain of evidence: the bloodstains, the DNA, the witnesses, and the testimony from Livye's friends about the abuse she had suffered. On the other side, the defense stuck to one narrative. Matthew had blacked out, and he had no memory of the events that night. The defense attorney tried to convince the jury that Matthew was a victim of his own mind. He argued that Matthew had been heavily intoxicated and that he wasn't in control of his actions. But how could the jury believe someone who had no recollection of killing his girlfriend when the evidence pointed directly to him? Livye's mother, Darcy Bass, took the stand with a broken heart. She spoke of the daughter she had raised, a compassionate, loving young woman who was full of potential. She described the shock she felt when she learned of her daughter's death, and how she could barely comprehend the idea that Matthew, the man Livye had loved, could be capable of such violence. As Darcy spoke, Matthew sat motionless. His lack of emotion contrasted sharply with the pain radiating from Livye's family. How could someone who claimed to love her show so little regard for her death? His indifference only made him seem more guilty in the eyes of the jury. The prosecution's case was built on the forensic evidence: DNA on the rifle, blood on Matthew's clothes, and the testimonies from Livye's friends about the abuse she endured. Every piece of evidence pointed to Matthew as the killer. Yet, he continued to deny responsibility, claiming that he didn't remember. As the jury deliberated, they had one question to answer. Did Matthew Edgar deserve to be convicted of murder, or had he truly blacked out and killed Livye in a fit of rage? The evidence seemed irrefutable, but the jury needed to be certain before delivering their verdict. Outside the courtroom, the public was watching closely. The case had captured the attention of people across the country. Livye's death had ignited a conversation about domestic violence, emotional abuse, and the power dynamics in relationships. Her story became a symbol of how easily someone could be controlled and manipulated without anyone noticing. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForLivye went viral. People shared their stories, expressing solidarity with Livye's family and bringing awareness to the issue of abuse. Domestic violence advocates rallied behind the case, using Livye's story as a way to educate others about the dangers of controlling relationships. Livye's co-workers and friends didn't just mourn her death, they fought to ensure her legacy would inspire change. They continued to raise awareness about the warning signs of abuse, urging others to stand up against it before it was too late. Matthew Edgar was convicted of Livye's murder. The jury found him guilty, but the journey didn't end there. For Livye's family, the fight was just beginning. The emotional toll of the trial had taken its toll, but they knew their fight would continue. For Livye, for justice, and for all the victims of domestic violence whose voices are too often silenced. Livye's legacy will live on, not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who knew her. Her life was tragically taken, but the love she gave and the lessons she taught will never be forgotten. Her story reminds us all to recognize the signs of abuse, to speak up when we see it, and to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves.
So that's how crimes end. And if you like this episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on the notifications. If you want me to do some special crimes in all over the world, comment down below, or you can send us direct through email, and I will see you in all my videos. See ya!